Hi, this is Robert Mahaffey. I'm the Film and Media Paraprof, and this is a recording of my first After Effects workshop series workshop, Basic Animation. So if you missed the class, then this will hopefully be a helpful guide to lead you through what we did in class and catch you up to speed so that you can be up to speed for the next class. So at the beginning of the workshop, I talked a little bit about what is After Effects. So After Effects is a digital visual effect, motion graphic, and compositing application, primarily used in the post-production of filmmaking and television. So what does that mean? Well, visual effects are the processes that allow us to create or manipulate any sort of visual imagery, whether that's photography, paintings, and of course video, but anything that we can't do in the context of a live shot in camera. And visual effects is sort of the process of integrating those generated images into the live action footage. And it's most often used when we're trying to create a look that would be just impossible to do, either because it's dangerous, or it's impractical, or it's very expensive, or it's literally impossible, like having someone fly across the sky. So there's a few links that I've included in the description of the video that will show you a few interesting bits of sort of visual effect history, both sort of how they used to do things and what it looks like today. And then you might ask, you might have heard when I said compositing application. So what is compositing? Well, compositing is what we're going to do. Compositing is when we bring together all those different assets, is what I'll call them. Assets are sources, so these different images, videos, etc., and we put them together, and that's compositing them. Okay, so let's begin. If you have done this stuff before, you can just sort of skim ahead and not worry about it, but I'm just going to start with the very basic. Let's open After Effects. So I'm using After Effects Creative Cloud. I'm actually on 2015, and our computers in the Film and Media Lab are a little more up to date, but the difference is, not noticeable for you. So After Effects opens, and I'm getting a little error message. Let's not worry about that. You'll always get this little warning, unless you click Never Again here. Don't worry about what this says. Hit OK. And here's After Effects. We're going to close the little dialog box as well. So this is what it looks like when you open up After Effects. And I wanted to talk briefly about where everything kind of is so that you will always be able to follow along as I'm talking about things. So right up here at the top, we have your pretty standard menu bar, File, Edit, and then a lot of other ones. And we'll talk more about what all these mean. Just below that, this is your toolbar. And these are where you're going to get a lot of the tools you're going to use. So the main tool you're always going to be using is the selection tool. And you can use V. You see it when I highlight over it. V is the keyboard shortcut to get to that. The hand, that's useful for moving sort of the video around. We'll talk about that more. Zoom, that's very useful. And there's a lot more up here, and we'll talk about when and why and how to use that later. So making our way down, and you notice whenever I click in one of these boxes, it gets this little blue outline. So the blue outline is kind of whatever box you're working in. And different effects and options and settings become available depending on which of these windows, as they're called, or panels that you're clicked in. So this right here is the project panel. You can see it says project. And this is where you're going to store all your media, all your sources, all your assets. So anything you import in, that's where it's going to go. To the right here in the main center part of the window is your composition panel. And the composition panel is where anything you're creating is going to be displayed. So this will be taken up once we start working by a little video screen, a little rectangle that'll play the video of whatever you're creating. Down here we have the timeline. So this whole box is the timeline, but the timeline itself is actually just this part over here on the right. And then this part to the left, this is the layer panel. And this will list all the layers you have working. And every single item, every single asset you bring into your project will have its own layer. And there's a lot of other kinds of layers as well. And then the timeline is where you see what the layers are doing over time. And don't worry if all of this doesn't make sense yet. Once we start putting this stuff in, it'll immediately click. Now, one thing to know about After Effects is you can have hundreds and hundreds of compositions in each project. So one project is not one video. You can have multiple compositions, and work on them and switch between them, and they can share the same list of assets and sources that you'll have over here in your project window. So this is very similar to, if you've used Adobe Premiere, it's very similar to sequences in Premiere. You can have a lot of them going on, but they're still sort of sharing the same base media. Over here, there's a few more windows. One we'll use today is the preview window right here. This will allow us to play stuff back, but I'll talk about that more later. So let's get started. The first thing I like to do is just sort of create some folders. I really like to be very organized in my projects, and so one way to do that is to have lots of folders in your project window to organize all your media. So in After Effects, there's like 10 ways to do everything. To make a new folder, you can Control-click, and it opens up this menu, and you can do a new folder that way. You can also come down here, right here, and there's a Create New Folder icon. Click that. And the other way is you can do File, New Folder. Now you notice there's also a keyboard shortcut, but that's like Shift, Command, Control, and N. That's a little too many buttons, so I don't usually use that one. So I've made some folders. I'm going to delete one, and I'm going to name them. I right-click to name, but you can also kind of double soft-click it, and theoretically that works. So rename. This one I'm going to call Sources, and this one I'm going to call Compositions. So I've got my two folders, and those look great. So now the next thing I want to do is I want to create a new composition. So compositions are the sort of place where we're going to combine all the different sources and create our final projects, whatever they are. So I'm going to make a new composition. Again, there's a lot of ways to do it. Control-click, New Composition. This little box down here, create a new composition. Composition, New Composition. Or, and this is an easy shortcut, is Command-N. And it opens up this box, says Composition Settings. So let's look at this box. The first thing at the top is the name. So I'm going to name it Basic Animation. Preset, I'm going to leave it at Custom so I can actually choose what I want. Now, here you can do any number of things, but I'm going to just match sort of standard video and keep it as it is, because this is sort of what I use most often. But 1920 by 1080, that's sort of the width and height of the pixels. And that's standard high definition video. So 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels tall. The pixel aspect ratio, square pixels, that's right. And then frame rate, I'm going to match sort of standard filmmaking and do 23.976 or 24. 23.976 is just sort of the way the digital filmmaking has sort of interpreted frame rate. I don't really know why. Don't worry about that. Resolution full, definitely. Start time code 0, that's great. Duration, something you want to change. I think for the size of this project, we only need 10, but you could see you could have up to like hours long. So 10 seconds is good though. And then background color, you can pick anything you want. I usually prefer black or white, and for this one, I'm going to do black. Hit OK, and let's get back out. And you see now I've got over here in my project window, little composition. So I'm going to make sure that's actually in the composition folder just to keep things neat. But here's our basic animation. And you see it's opened up this big black box here in the composition panel. This is sort of the video window where we're going to see what we're working on. And you see down here the timeline's woken up. There's a basic animation tab down here, and everything's ready to go. You see we've got this playhead. I'll talk about that. One thing real quick before we move forward, I want to just make sure my composition is fitting inside my composition window. Really easy way to do that is go over to here to the 100%, and let's actually choose Fit. Fit is going to resize it so the whole thing fits in the box. That means if I were to resize the box, you don't have to do this, but just showing you, it'll change to fit. So I've got a composition. I want to get some sources as well. And so I've included a link to the sources so you can download the same ones I use for this project. This is going to make it a lot easier for you because these sources have been sort of pre-prepared for what we're doing, and you can more easily follow along if you have the same sources. So to import footage or pictures or paintings or whatever, of course there's any number of ways to do it. So Control-click and import and file, that would be one way. You can also go to File at the top and Import File, or Command-I is the shortcut. So let's do Import File, and they're right here on my desktop under Sources. And I just need Rocket Ship Transparency, Moon Background, and Earth Transparency. You shouldn't have this one. Don't worry about that one. So those are imported in, and you see they're all over here, stored in this little project window with their names. And you can even see a little preview of what they are. Now I'm going to make sure those are nicely, neatly sorted into my sources window. Right now you're like, well, Robert, there's only 4 items in your project panel. Why do you need so many neat folders? If you have more than just these 4 objects, it'll be really nice to have folders to keep it neat and sorted, because you could have hundreds upon hundreds of pictures and videos and compositions that you're dealing with all at once. So let's get started. Before we actually get any further, let's save this, because it's still an untitled project. It could crash and lose everything. So I'm going to go File, Save. I'm just going to save it to my desktop. You could save it to a hard drive or wherever you want it to work. So I'm going to call it Basic Animation, and I'm going to call it Basic Animation V1. And this allows me to know this is version 1, this is the first thing we did. Now what's nice about this is After Effects has a great little feature under File, and it's called Increment and Save. So this means when I click this, it's actually going to save an entirely new version of the project called Basic Animation, and it'll change the name to V2. And this will allow V1 to stay as it was, and if I mess anything up in V2, I'll always be able to go back to V1 and keep and sort of fix things before I move forward again. So I'm actually going to do that now, just leave the sort of base project ready to go. Increment and save, and you see up here, the project is now Basic Animation V2. Okay, so we're saved, up and running. We've got our assets loaded in, our sources, and we've got a composition to work in. Now that we've got everything in, I just want to show you what I made using the Earth, the Moon, and the rocket ship, and what we're going to try and recreate today. So I had it on the desktop real quick here. So this is what we're going to make today. It's a pretty simple animation, but I want you to see what we're going for so that you can put it all together yourself. So let's start. Let's start working with layers and animating things. So the first thing I'm going to bring in is the rocket ship transparency. Now we need to bring this into our composition, and of course there's a lot of ways to do it. So the first way is click, drag, and you can just place it right here in the composition window wherever you want it. Now if you notice, it'll nicely snap to the top and the bottom and the sides. It'll also, if you can find it, it'll snap to the middle. See right here? Snap. So I'm going to let it snap to the middle. And boom, we've got our first layer in our composition. And you can see it's been updated down here. Here's our layer, rocket ship transparency, number 1, down here in the layer panel. And there's this nice long gray box in the timeline to show us that this layer lasts through the whole 10 seconds of our timeline. Now there's a few other ways to import or to sort of add sources into your composition. I'm going to delete that for now. You can just drag them into the layer panel. Ta-da, that's easy enough. You can go File, Add Footage to Comp, or Command / right there. And that'll add it right in the center. You notice when I put it in the layer panel, it also dropped it right in the center. That's really convenient. You can also add layers to only appear at different parts of the timeline, and you see a little tiny blue playhead will move along. And when I place it here, this layer actually only exists around 5 seconds onward. So if I delete the first one, you can see it doesn't exist until 5 seconds. So I want it to just start at the beginning though, and I'm going to let it be right in the middle. So now we've got our rocket ship in our composition. And I'd like to talk about how we can edit the rocket ship layer right here in the composition window. So you see when I click on it, I get all these little sort of gray purple boxes. And right here in the middle, it's a little hard to see, is a little crosshair. So first, this thing is called the anchor point. And we're not going to talk too much about the anchor point today, other than you should know that the anchor point is the center of the layer. So any animation we're doing is going to be based around the center anchor point. You can move this anchor point to a different part of the layer, and that can be useful for a number of reasons. But for now, we'll just know that the anchor point is the center of the layer, and anything we do is affecting the anchor point, really, more than just the layer itself. So we can resize our rocket ship right here by grabbing these boxes and moving it around. And this is pretty standard. You've probably done this before, even in Word or Photoshop or anything like that. You notice, though, while I'm doing it, that I can't keep it the same size as it was, or the same, aspect ratio as it was. It's getting fatter or thinner or whatever. What you can do, though, is you can hold Shift, and that's going to actually allow you to just scale it up and down the size it was, the shape it was, the aspect ratio. You can actually see what you're doing if you come down here into the layer panel and click this little arrow, and that sort of twirls it down and open, and you see this next thing called transform. If you click that arrow down, and here's all the properties of the layer. So we've got the anchor point, and you can see that has some information. Don't worry about that for now, but we've got position, scale, rotation, and opacity. Those are the sort of core 4 properties for any layer, and that's what we're going to work on animating today. So you see, as we change the size of the rocket ship, you can see the 2 numbers for scale down here are moving. They're moving around, and they're changing. If we hold the shift key, they move together because it's scaling to the same size. But if it's moving separately, then we've got sort of the x-axis scale size and the y-axis scale size. Those are the 2 numbers. So I'm going to say we'll just leave it right about where it was, almost 100. Oops, almost 100%. And let's try moving just its position around. So I'm going to click and drag. We've kind of done this before. But you see the position numbers now down in the layer panel down here are moving. And these position numbers represent where the anchor point, so the center of the layer, is on the sort of rectangle that is our video screen. And these pixel numbers equate to the 1920 width by the 1080 height. And you can see that. Let's go to View. You don't have to do this. Show Rulers. And you see the video square is from 0 to 1920. And if I put the rocket about here, you'll see it's about 600 in the x-axis. And over here, it's about 350 in the y-axis. Okay, so turning off rulers. And that's what happens when you move this rocket ship around. It's changing its x and y coordinates. We can also rotate the rocket. So to do that, we actually have to get a new tool out, and you can find it up here in the toolbar. It's this one, Rotation Tool. And the shortcut is W. I'm not sure why. Maybe it stands for wotation. So we've got our rotation tool out. Now we just click on the rocket and we can spin it. And it just spins right on around. Now you're like, oh, well, I want to be a little more precise to the 45 and 90 degree angles as I'm spinning. So never fear. As always, you can hold Shift and it'll help you out. So Shift locks you to only turning on the 45 and 90 degrees. And that's really useful. And you can see down here, these numbers are changing as I spin. And there's 2 numbers down there. I'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see the degrees changing in the rotation panel, 204.2, and it keeps turning around all the way to 360. So that's how we rotate the rocket. So that's what we can do when we want to just quickly edit a layer up in the composition panel. You can also edit layers down here in the layer panel. So the same numbers you see moving, we can actually just move ourselves and edit them. So there's a couple ways to do that. One is to sort of click and drag on the numbers, and you see a different little icon has appeared where my selection tool was. This is called scrubbing. So I'm scrubbing the x-axis number back and forth. Now, if you want to be a little more precise while you're scrubbing, you can hold the command key, and you see it moves really fine, very slow and fine movements. Holding the shift key, you're going to get big, fast, quick movements. So be careful with the shift key. And that's the same for the y-axis, up and down, shift key, command key. The other thing you can do is if you know exactly the coordinates you want it to go to, you can type them in. So I'm going to do 1200, and you see it jumps over here. Let's put 100 here, and it goes way up there. So that's how we can move the position down here. And that's the same for scale and rotation, and we'll get to opacity. So scale, you see I can move it bigger, smaller, etc. Now you notice when you're moving it, and even when you click and type, let's say 150, they move together. They're actually locked together, and that's what this little chain icon is for, constraining their proportions. If you want to change the scale separately, like you did just by dragging the little gray boxes, you can unclink this chain, and you can move them individually and type individually. But I like them chained together because I want it to be the same size. So notice though, if it was actually, let's put it back this way for a sec, if I chain it back together now, they actually don't adjust back to being the same, but they allow it to be this new odd proportion, kind of a fat rocket, and now they move together again and you can scale it up or down. So that can be really useful if you want to sort of distort the shape of something, but then change its size in that same distorted shape. But anyway, I'm going to put it back. So let's just say 100 and 100, and we'll lock it. Now, if you ever mess anything up down here, in the layer panel is this button that says reset, and that's just going to reset everything. So it puts the rocket back in the middle, puts it back to 100% scale, 0, 0 rotation, and 100% opacity. So again, rotation is the same. We grab this thing and we can scrub it along. We can also click and type like 280, boom. Now, the first number here, the 0x, actually changes as we go to 360 and beyond. You see it becomes 1x. So that stands for it's gone one full rotation. Now that doesn't matter when we're just sort of spinning it around and setting it to a position, but when we're animating it, we'll want it to know how many rotations it's supposed to do. Is it supposed to just do 1x and then this far around, or is it supposed to do 2x and that far around? Because that'll matter to see how many times it spins around in circles. And finally, opacity. So opacity is something you cannot edit just by clicking on your layer up in the composition panel, but you can edit down here by scrubbing this number. And you see when I scrub it down to 0, it fades out. So that can be really useful as well. And of course, you can click and type specific numbers. So that's how you actually edit all the properties of a layer. But how do we animate the properties of a layer? So before we start actually animating, I want to make sure we see that there's this little red line with the blue top here. This is called the playhead. And the playhead is vitally important to any animation we're doing because it allows us to know where in the timeline we are. So right now we're at about 3 seconds, maybe 3.5 seconds here. And you can see we can go all the way to 10 and all the way back to 0. You can also see where you are in time with sort of the time code number over here. This actually shows us there's 87 frames, and we're at 3 seconds and 15 frames. And you can drag and scrub this number, just like you scrub numbers in the layer panel. You can also click and type in. Let's try 2. So, sorry, you couldn't see the playhead while I was doing that, but you grab and scrub it around, and you see the playhead moving. You can click and type in 2, and it moves it to 2 seconds. You can also click and type the frames if you want. You have to like double click. I'm not sure how to do that. Don't worry about that. So we got to know where in time we are because that's going to really matter to our animation. So let's start the animation at the beginning. And let's say we just for now want to have the rocket fly up and across the screen. So I'm going to drag the rocket down here a bit so it's partly gone off the screen actually. And what we're going to do to start animating is we're going to go over here into our layer panel and we're going to press this little button next to position because we want to animate its position where it's moving from and to, and we want to click the stopwatch icon. We click this and you'll see right here under the playhead this little diamond shape appeared. This is one of the most important shapes in all of After Effects. This is called a keyframe. And you see also when I turned on the stopwatch turned blue, and we got this little arrow and keyframe and arrow thing over here. Now what a keyframe's doing is a keyframe actually captures the property, in this case 928.5 by 1268.9. It captures these numbers for this moment in time, right here. Now it actually has captured them for all moments in time because we haven't added a second keyframe yet. So let's add a second keyframe now that we have our first one. So let's drag this all the way to like 7 seconds. Now there's a couple ways to do this, but we basically just need to edit the layer and its properties. So I could click here and drag. I could click and type. Or I can actually just move the rocket itself to where I want it to go. And you'll notice I've actually dropped a new keyframe right here where the playhead was. And so this is recording the position numbers for this new point in time. And what's going to automatically happen in between is the rocket's going to move from that point in time to this point in time, and it's going to change its position numbers along the way in a nice, smooth motion. So this is animation. And if you want to play it back instead of just dragging the playhead along, you can go up here to your preview window, and you can just press this play key or the shortcut spacebar. And you see we've animated our rocket to move. So from the first keyframe to the second keyframe, it moves. And you see once it gets past the second keyframe, it stops because it's not told to go anywhere else. There's no more keyframes for it to be changing its properties to. Now, the other thing you'll notice is you have to be clicked on the layer. You notice we've created this line. This is called a motion path. And we'll talk a little more about this motion path later, but, oops. Oh dear. You can see the motion path actually shows us where the rocket starts and where it's going. So I've made it a little more obvious so it's not off the screen. And you can see on the motion path there are all these little tiny dots along the way, and then there's these two big dots at either end. So these dots at either end, these square dots, so not really dots, squares, these are called the handles, and they also represent the keyframes. So this dot over here to the right, that's the farther keyframe, and you see it even lights up blue when I click on it. And this one to the left, that's the keyframe here at the beginning. So those represent where the rocket starts and stops. And you'll notice the motion path goes right through the anchor point. So these keyframes, these handles, actually represent where the anchor point is at the first keyframe and the last keyframe. And then all the little dots along the line represent where the anchor point is at each frame of the video in between the two keyframes. So that motion path we'll talk a little more about later because it's really quite handy to use. There's a few other things we need to know while we're working in here. So you saw me hit play over here to play through the video, and that's really handy. Also up here there's a previous frame, a next frame, and then a last and first frame. And so you see if I press next frame, it moves along one frame at a time, last frame back the other way, and then first frame jumps to the very beginning of the timeline, and last frame to the very end of the timeline. So let's jump back to the beginning. So that's really useful to know. Now, we've got two keyframes, but let's try and add a third. To add a third keyframe, let's maybe put it right in the middle. And we're going to take the rocket, and we can, of course, click and drag it here, or we could move the numbers here. And we've added a third keyframe in the middle. So now the rocket actually takes a really interesting little swooping path. Kind of a weird way for a rocket to move, but that's okay. That's what it looks like. And you can see when I click on it, the third keyframe has appeared in the middle of the motion path, and you've got these nice curves of the motion path. We'll talk a little more about why these aren't perfect diagonal lines in a minute. That's just the way After Effects defaults it. It assumes you want the curve as opposed to straight lines. Now what if we think, let's actually delete the middle keyframe for a minute, and you notice I can just click and press delete. What if we want to actually change these keyframes? I did that before, but I did it very quickly and you guys maybe didn't notice. So to change the keyframes, you can't just click on them and move the numbers around, because remember that it always adds the keyframe where the playhead is. So you see it's added a new keyframe here even though I was clicked on the second keyframe. So I'm going to press undo. And with After Effects, never fear. Undo is your friend. Undo will go hundreds and hundreds of undos back. Maybe not hundreds and hundreds, but it'll go a long way back. So you can undo a long, long way. And to undo, Command-Z is a shortcut on Mac, or edit and undo, and in this case it was me deleting the keyframe was the last thing to undo. But you see there's a history very long of all the undos I could potentially undo. Okay, so to change keyframes, we actually have to make sure our playhead is on top of the keyframe. So you say, okay, I'll drag it and it's on top, great, and I move it. Well, no, you've actually missed, and it's hard to see, but if you zoom in, you can see there's actually two keyframes there. So we really need to make sure we're actually on top of the keyframe we want to edit. Now there's a couple ways to do that. One is while you're dragging the keyframe, hold shift and it'll snap. Or while you're dragging the playhead, hold shift and it'll snap to the keyframe along the way. And this is one way of knowing you're on top of it. The other way you'll know is if you're on top of it, over here in the layer panel, this little keyframe icon will light up blue. Now you notice if I take the playhead off, it goes sort of gray outline. And then the other way to move the playhead directly to the keyframe is actually with these icons over here. This is called the keyframe navigator. So if I click on the thing here, it's go to previous keyframe. And you see it jumps back to that keyframe. And again, I'll jump all the way back. So this is a good way of quickly jumping around the keyframes and making sure you land on the keyframe. So now that we've got the playhead on the keyframe, we actually can change the values of this keyframe. So now if I move the rocket, I'm actually changing this keyframe values to be for the rocket to be up here. I I can make it go farther, shorter, wherever I want it to go. I can change the numbers over here by scrubbing them or by typing, etc., etc. So that's great because that allows us to change sort of where the keyframe is. But what if we want to change the speed with which the rocket moves along this line? Well, the easiest way to do that is to just actually move the keyframe itself closer to the beginning so that the rocket does its path in less time. And you can see when I play back, it moves a lot faster because it only takes about 4 seconds instead of 7. And it stops when it gets to that keyframe. Now you can just click and drag the keyframe like I did. But you can also, if you want to make sure it goes to the exact spot you want, you can place the playhead where you want, grab the keyframe, hold shift, and it'll snap to that spot along the way. So that's a way of speeding up the movement during that course of time. So now let's figure out how to animate a few more properties. To do this, I'm actually going to erase everything I've done except for the rocket itself. And to do that, we can actually go and click on the stopwatch again, and this will delete all the keyframes we have. And I'm going to then reset the rocket, and it goes up there. So let's now bring in those other sources we have. We have a very cool background. It's called the moon background. And then the Earth transparency, that's a little Earth shape. So importing your sources into your composition is, as you remember, pretty easy. We can drag in here, we can drag up here, or we can go File and Add Footage to Comp, or the shortcut command \. Notice though, if I just grab moon background and drop it in here, it actually goes right on top of my rocket ship. Now that's not a big deal because down here in the layer panel, we can reorder them in any way we want. So I'm going to drag moon under rocket, and you see the black line to demonstrate I've done that, and place it. And now my rocket is on top of my moon layer. If you had just dragged the moon background layer right down into here, you could make sure via that same black line that it was under the rocket ship. And I'm going to bring in my Earth as well. So again, I've dropped the Earth on top. I think I want the rocket on top of the Earth, but the Earth to still be above the moon. So I'm going to move the rocket on top of that as well. So you notice we've got a very large rocket and an even larger Earth and a huge picture of a moon. So let's actually start resizing some of these layers. So I'm going to actually take Earth away for the moment. And you can of course delete it and then bring it back in, but a handy tool is over here in the layer panel. We can just hide things by clicking on the eye. So you see when I click on that eye, it turns the Earth layer on and off. It's still there, it's just hiding. And I'm going to hide the rocket too for a second. So we've just got our moon background. And I kind of want to make it a little smaller so it doesn't take up as much of the frame. So I can of course open up its transform panels by twirling these little arrows down. And we could do scale, and we can grab and drag it here. I also think it's pretty handy with, especially to do a background, you can take your window size and zoom it out. So I'm going to try what's 33.3%. And you actually see via the outline of this moon picture how much bigger it is than the space we're working in. It's because it's a very high quality picture. It's actually a higher quality than the 1920 by 1080 of our window. So I'm going to grab the corner and kind of drag it down, holding shift to keep it constrained to proportions. I'm going to actually drag it down almost as much as I can. And then I'm going to move it, and I'm going to move it down. Now one thing when you're moving position around, I think I forgot to mention before, when you're moving position around, it just sort of moves like this. But once again, if you hold shift, it's going to lock it to allow you to move it perfectly straight up and down or perfectly straight left and right. So that's really handy. So I'm going to have it down about here. So let's fit our screen again, fit. And that looks pretty nice. We've got a sort of bottom landscape layer of the moon. A little bit of the mountain is sticking up over here. I think that's quite nice. So let's bring Earth back. And maybe I shouldn't have zoomed back in so quickly because the Earth is huge as well. So same thing with the Earth. I'm going to shrink it down. I'm going to shrink it way down because the Earth isn't too big, even when you're on the moon. And make it sort of this upper corner area here. So there's our Earth. And I think I might have just messed up its proportions. So let's see. Open down the Earth menu. Yep, I did. So let's make sure those are the same. Oops, that's not what I wanted. Well, I'll just type it in now. So let's try 15% is roughly what I was at. And we'll move the moon's position up here. Okay, and now let's bring our rocket back. So our rocket looks a little big right now, I think. So I'm going to shrink the rocket down as well. And I'm just going to do it here because I think that's a little easier to do it in the layer panel. It's about 39%, maybe a little smaller. Let's try 35. I'll just type it in. 35%. So there, I think that's a pretty reasonable sized rocket. Looks a little farther away from the camera on the moon, and we're ready to go. So what we want to do is we want to figure out how to send this rocket to Earth. So from the very basic start, we remember, let's bring our playhead back to the beginning, and let's turn on the position stopwatch for the rocket ship. And it adds a keyframe here for this first position of the rocket ship. So let's say we want it to take almost the full length of the video. So we'll do 9 seconds, and leaving us 1 second at the end. And let's have the rocket at Earth. So let's just drag it there. Great, right? We've done it. The rocket goes to Earth. But it doesn't really go to Earth like a rocket would go to Earth, right? It just kind of goes on this weird straight diagonal line, and it just goes right to Earth, and then it stops. So that doesn't look very realistic, because that's not how rockets fly. And there's a lot of other things going wrong as well. So how do we make this look a little more realistic? Well, we remember how to add a second, or in this case a third keyframe, and I'm going to put it right in the middle. So 4:15, that's about the middle. We could do it exactly at 4:12, and that's the middle point. So for here, I think I want to have the rocket actually go up, because when it takes off from the moon, it needs to go up in a straight line. So I'm going to set that point here. Now you see I'm dealing with a little bit of an issue because of this curve. I really want to make sure that curve is not a curve in this case, but is a lot straighter. And that's where these motion paths come into play. So I talked a little bit about these handles at each keyframe along the way. Let me just move the rocket a little more towards Earth. And you can see these handles have these weird lines coming out of them, these lines with sort of those circular dots on the end. So each keyframe, or handle as it's called on the motion path, is what's called an auto-bezier. And a bezier is a kind of curve. It's a parametric curve. There's some kind of math stuff going on there. I don't really understand it. But it creates this curve shape. And what these sort of circular long bits coming out of the handles allow us to do is actually manipulate the curve itself. So you see, as I move this handle, I can move the curve. If I make the handle longer, I sort of change the way the curve is as well, making it a bigger or smaller curve. I can even twist it around in weird circles. So what I want to do is I'm going to manipulate my motion path to try and make it as straight a line from takeoff as possible. So that's a pretty straight line. Now I think it'd be cool actually if the rocket were to go straight up into space and then it actually does a bit of a loop as if it's gathering some kind of speed it needs to go to Earth. I don't know if that's actually astrophysics, but that's what we're going to do. So what I've done here is I've created kind of a straight up line, and the rocket goes up that line. I need a little more room here. And it goes around this big loop, and then it shoots off towards Earth. And I think that's going to be a pretty cool effect. So don't worry if your motion path doesn't look exactly like this, because I've done this a couple times now. But let's see what happens when the rocket follows it. So the rocket goes up, and it loops around, and off it goes to Earth. So that looks pretty good, right? Play it, rocket goes up, like it's launching off the moon. It loops around, and it heads off to Earth. But you're wondering, okay, this still doesn't look very realistic, and there's a couple reasons why. The first one is because the rocket, even as it gets farther away from the surface of the moon, going up and then away into space and towards Earth, it stays the same size. So we're going to actually animate the scale. So we haven't done this yet, but it works exactly the same as animating position. So we have to turn on scale stopwatch, and you see on the scale line, it creates a keyframe right here. And it's setting a keyframe for the beginning to be 35%. Now, I think the scale is going to be pretty easy to animate. I don't think we need more than one keyframe, or more than 2 keyframes. So let's drag this to the same end where it arrives at Earth. And let's make the scale sort of appropriate to how big the rocket should be when it gets to Earth. So I'm going to go way, way, way down. Let's try like 3%. You can barely even see it. It's still there. You see it's this little tiny thing. But that's about the size, that's about the size you would see when you lost track of it, because we're on the moon, we can't see it get to Earth. So this is already going to look better. We see the rocket take off. It actually gets farther away from the moon immediately. It goes around its little loop, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and then it's basically gone, right? It gets to Earth. So that actually looks pretty good. So you might say, though, well, when a rocket's going to make its turn at the top of its loop, it's not going to make its turn still pointing straight up, and it's not going to go towards Earth still pointing straight up. That's not how a rocket flies, right? So the next thing we need to animate to make it look more realistic is the rotation. So same thing with rotation. Let's turn on the stopwatch, and I'm going to turn it on right at the beginning. Now, rotation is nice because it actually shows us the motion path, and you'll see why this matters. Because rotation, the rotation of the rocket has to match the motion path. Now, we've kind of set ourselves up for a little more work than normal because I added this loop-the-loop. But what we want to do is let's, every couple of seconds, add a new keyframe that's going to keep the nose of the rocket on the path, on the motion path. So I'm going to go 1.5 seconds. And you can see the nose of the rocket is a little bit off the motion path. So let's go and get our rotation tool by pressing W or going up to the top here. And a nice thing about any tools you grab up here is if you only need them for just a second, you can actually hold down W, make your adjustment, and I'm going to make sure the rocket is pointing along its path. And then if you let go of W, it gives you back the selection tool. This is as opposed to hitting W, letting go, having the rotation tool, and having to hit V or go up and press it up here again. So that's a handy little trick when using that keyboard shortcut. So let's move our playhead along a little farther until the rocket gets off its path pretty bad again. And you see right here it's pretty far off the path. So get our rotation tool. We're adding a new keyframe, automatically doing it for us as we've rotated the rocket. Change that property, it drops the keyframe for us. So let's keep going. And already it's pretty far off again. There we go. And a little farther, right? Let's do it right at the second keyframe on the position path. Oops, come on, buddy. There you go. And spin it around. And it keeps going. Maybe about here we need another one already. This is such a tight turn. Pointing the nose along the path. A little farther. Pointing the nose along the path. And let's do one more for good luck. This is going to get hard to see. So I'm going to actually zoom in, which you can do down here by making it bigger. Or you can use the zoom key, the magnifying glass, or Z, and just sort of click your way in. And just one more. Still along the path, and I think that's pretty good. So let's fit that back to size, and let's play it back and see what it looks like. Pressing spacebar. So that looks pretty good. It's got a few funny moves as it's going around the top of the turn. It does some of those turns rather quickly. But for the most part, I think that's okay. It is a cartoon rocket, after all. Now, one more touch I think would be nice to make sure it's really clear that the rocket has disappeared down towards Earth, is if we actually add a small animation of the rocket's opacity. That'll kind of fade it out once it gets right there to sort of northern Mexico right there. So let's start it 2 frames back, maybe, from the end point. And let's turn on the stopwatch for opacity. So notice this is the only one we're not starting at the beginning. We're going to tell it from the beginning all the way to this point, still have 100% opacity. And only now, towards the end of this timeline, are we going to edit your opacity. And I've only given it about 2 frames. So this is going to be a very quick animation for the opacity from 100 to 0. And you'll see what this does. I'll start it about halfway. Is it sends the rocket to Earth, and then it fades it out as if it went right down into Earth's atmosphere. You can see right there, it just sort of disappears down to Earth. So that all looks pretty good, right? We've animated our rocket, it takes off, it goes around its little loop-the-loop. It's a little bit odd, but that's okay. It's getting its speed, and off it goes to Earth, and it disappears into Earth's atmosphere. So we've done it, right? But there's a few more things we could do to kind of make this look a little more legitimate. So there's a handy tool when you're working with keyframes called the Easy Ease. This is spelled E-A-S-Y, E-A-S-E. And the Easy Ease is a way of allowing the property shift that's going on as it goes towards the keyframe to kind of slow down as it approaches the keyframe and then speed up as it goes away from the keyframe. It's easing into the keyframe and easing away from the keyframe. It's kind of like an acceleration or a deceleration. And so this is especially important if we're moving people, vehicles, really anything that's not a computerized thing. Because when our rocket flies, it looks very computerized. It goes straight up at the exact speed. It spins around, always at the same speed, and it moves off always at the same speed. But that's not actually how rockets move. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an easy ease for its position from the beginning takeoff, because the rocket would start slow and then build up its speed, as opposed to just starting at speed like it just jumped off the surface of the moon. So to add an easy ease, we're going to click on the keyframe we want, and we're going to control click, and it's going to open up this little menu. There's lots of helpful stuff in this menu, but we're going to go down to Keyframe Assistant, and you see there's 3 kinds of easy ease. So which one do we want? Well, the normal easy ease has it allows easing from the beginning, or from before the keyframe and after the keyframe. Then there's easy ease in. Easy ease in adds sort of a deceleration as the properties go into the keyframe. They ease in to the keyframe from before it. And then easy ease out is the opposite. It adds sort of the acceleration away from the keyframe. It eases out of the keyframe and gets faster and faster. So since we're at the beginning, we don't need the double easy ease. We're going to use the easy ease out because the rocket is easing out of this first keyframe. And so if we watch, when we play it back, it kind of takes off a little slower and gets up to speed. And I think that looks better, but it does something weird. You notice that our scale animation starts immediately. And that doesn't really make any sense because the rocket hasn't gotten very far away yet, but it's already shrinking down very quickly. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add an easy ease out on the scale keyframe. So that's the second one here. And we're going to go down to Keyframe Assistant and an easy ease out. What's nice is the easy eases are set to the same time. I believe that's something you can change in preferences, but you don't need to do that right now. So these 2 eases will work at the same time. So the rocket is going to shrink down and leave the moon surface at the same sort of slow to begin with and getting faster and faster speed. So let's play it. And that looks pretty good, as if it took off from the moon and then it got to its little loop-the-loop turn and off it went. So I'm also going to add the easy ease on the rotation because it starts rotating kind of weird early for me. And let's see what that looks like. I think that looks pretty good. It definitely is still doing some odd turning with the rotation to go through the loop-the-loop, but that's what we've sort of decided for it to do. Now, I also think I should add an easy ease on the rocket's arrival at Earth. I want it to kind of really slow down a little as it gets to Earth, because right now it shoots into Earth like a missile. You see it goes boom, right into Earth. So I'm going to add the opposite easy ease. Since this is the last keyframe, we don't need the double as well. We're going to do the easy ease in, so it eases into the keyframe. And I'll do it on scale as well, because they're sort of working together. And let's see what that looks like from the middle. So you see right about here, it's going to sort of slow down and arrive. And I think that looks really nice. My only complaint is now I think it needs to fade out a little faster. Or start a little sooner. So I'm going to move the opacity keyframe back. And these are all nitpicking ways of making it look a little nicer and smoother. There's obviously a lot more we could do, even with the rocket's loop, to make that look a little more realistic. But for now, I think this is pretty good. I think I'm going to add one more rotation keyframe sort of towards the end here. That's going to turn the rocket a little farther towards, oops, it's hard to see because of the motion path, just a little farther up, pointing up. So let's watch it. Oh, that looks kind of funny. I'm going to delete that one. So clicking and deleting. Okay, so now we've given our rocket some acceleration and deceleration with the easy eases. But there's one more major thing we can do to make it look a little more realistic, and that's motion blur. So motion blur is something that happens in cameras because the camera's shutter speed, which is how long the camera is exposing the film or the sensor to light, is, though it's very quick usually, 1/50th or 1/100th of a second, that's actually a long time when it comes to motion. So it's opened itself up and it lets light in, and in that time things can actually move a lot. So you see there's some cameras that'll shoot 1/1000, 1/10,000th of a second, and with that you can like capture the beads of sweat dripping off a hummingbird or something like that. But film and pretty common photography is usually a slower shutter speed. So 1/50th of a second is what we use primarily in filmmaking, at least in 24 frame per second filmmaking. And that actually adds a lot of motion blur for any fast movement because the camera isn't actually capturing every single frame. You see the rocket for every single frame of this. That's not what it would look like if we actually filmed a rocket taking off. The rocket would be a bit of a moving blur at various points along the way. And even the human eye has a little motion blur. You can test that out if you wave something, possibly just your hand in front of your eye. Your eye is not actually able to fully see every single frame of your hand along the way. It sees sort of a ghostly blur of it. So to replicate this, After Effects actually does a lot of the work for us. So you have to turn on motion blur for your whole composition, and you do that right here with this sort of circle. And you see it says enables motion blur for all layers with the motion blur switch set. So after I click it, it turns blue, but that actually hasn't done it yet because we have to enable on the layers the motion blur switch. So that's right here, and it's on each layer you'll see. Rocket ship has one, and all of them have it right down. So let's click it on just the rocket ship one. Because the Earth and the Moon aren't moving, we don't need to add motion blur for them. Now you see, if I click along the way, the rocket actually gets blurry. You see it was much clearer before, and now it's kind of a blurry, hazy image. This is showing the motion blur. You can see it even more as it's moving this way. You see kind of a stretched rocket as it's moving along. Now if we play back, this is going to help it look a little more realistic. The motion blur sells it a little more for our eyes because it looks like the rocket is moving. And it looks like it was captured on a real camera. So motion blur and easy eases are two really handy little ways to make something you've made look a little more realistic. So I just want to add one more nice touch at the end. I want to kind of fade out my video. So it starts, and that's fine. We could fade it in, but I think it's fine for it to start on the image. But maybe right here after the rocket gets to Earth, I want to fade out the moon and the Earth, fade everything to black. Now this is something you could do later if you brought this into a video editor, but actually After Effects is perfectly suited to do it. So I'm going to twirl close the rocket ship transparency, and let's open Earth transparency and the moon the moon background layer. And I'm going to click the stopwatch for both of their opacities. And then I'm going to drag the playhead to the end, and I'm going to set their opacity to 0 at the end. And that's going to make a nice little fade out for the last second of the video. That's going to fade both of them out. So you can see, if I play from somewhere in the middle, rocket gets to Earth, and everything fades out. And that's the end of our little video. I think that's really nice. So there were a few more things I wanted to show real quick. These don't really relate to the rocket or the moon, but they're just handy tools that it's good to know. So the first one is the grid. You can turn on the grid by going View and Show Grid. There's also Command apostrophe, or over here, there's this little thing next to the Fit window, and it says Choose Grid and Grid Options, and you can click Grid. Now you see the grid is this green thing with all these little boxes and larger boxes. Each of these boxes represents a number of pixels, and the larger boxes represent more or less of them. The nice thing about the grid, I think you have to turn it on in View, is Snap to Grid. And this allows us to move a layer and have it sort of snap to the grid lines. So I'm moving this along grid lines. This can be really useful if you have a specific spot you need to place a layer. Undo, undo. Let's turn that grid off. And the other kind of grid I like a lot is the proportional grid. And this will divide it up into a few less crazy lines, just sort of into proportions of the screen. I don't think the default looks like this. This is one I've set, which divides it into thirds, because in filmmaking and photography and art, we really like rules of thirds. So you see I've actually done a pretty good job of even putting the rocket on the third line to begin with. And it goes up the third line, and then it kind of travels along this third line. And that was completely by accident, but it's pretty nice. And it makes it more visually appealing. Even the moon background is a little bit low, but it's basically on the third line as well. The other thing you can find in the exact same box over here, and as well as in, actually it's not in View, I'm not sure where it is. So in here is the title and action safe boxes. So these come from a time, and it still matters to this day, though a little bit less so, but these title and action safe grids boxes come from a time when not everyone had the same television, and different televisions were kind of different shapes. And one of the biggest things with older televisions is they used to curve off at the edges and sort of distort the image to the sides. So the title and action safe grid allowed you to know which of the items in your video, your composition, were within a safe area for anyone's television. And so this outer box is the action safe box. So this means anything inside this box is going to be fine. But any action, any important action happening outside this box might get lost, cropped out, or distorted on some people's screens. Again, this doesn't matter as much now because a lot of things are on widescreen televisions and laptops, but even projectors and TVs will sometimes crop out the edges, so you have to be careful. The inner box, or set of boxes in this case, is the title safe grid. This is where you can put titles within this box, and that's for sure keeping them safe from getting cropped out, because you could lose a little bit of the edge of your action in the action safe box, but you really don't want to lose any of your titles, because if they get cropped off, then people won't be able to read them. So this inner box is the title safe box, and then there's two sort of inner boxes in that box, and those are for different size screens. So the outer one is sort of HD, the middle one, I'm not actually sure, and then the inner one is sort of the 4x3 old school square, almost square TV. So those grids can be really useful so that you know to not crop out anything important. You see all the important stuff that happens here, the moon, the rocket, or the main part of the moon that we're on, the rocket, and the Earth are all within the action safe grid. I think maybe when it hits the peak of its thing, yeah, like the edge of it goes out, but that's not the end of the world because it sort of stays mostly within the screen. So I'll turn that off. And the final thing that I thought might be good to show today is the Align window. So if it's not open on yours, you can go to Window and Align. And I've actually closed it now, so Window, Align to open it back up. And this is a really handy thing because it helps us move layers and align them to certain edges. So you saw when we were setting layers, we can always sort of, when you're first dropping them into the composition, you can snap them to the edge. But once they're in, you want to align them. And you can align to composition. So all these little boxes, horizontal left alignment, this is vertical or sort of horizontal center, horizontal right, and then top and bottom and sort of the vertical center. So if you wanted to place the rocket center, you could do this align, or sort of this one here, and it's already on that one. So center. Or if you wanted top left, you can do that. And that's really helpful if you're trying to arrange layers. There's also the distribute layers. I'll talk about that more. That allows you to line up a whole number of layers and then evenly distribute them across the space. So those are the main things. The only other thing I would say, since we opened up our window tab, is if you ever for some reason start getting a really weird workspace, maybe you've accidentally closed your timeline, deleted that, you like undock your project panel and it's just floating around and you're just like, Robert, I can't figure out where anything is. If you go up to your window and you go to Workspace, you can do Reset Standard. So the standard workspace was the one we were working, and you can see there's a bunch of other possible kinds of workspaces. But if we hit Reset Standard, it'll say, are you sure you want to reset it to its original layout? You say yes. It's going to put it all back to the way you just had it when you were working and everything was great before you accidentally closed everything. So that's really useful in case you mess anything up or get lost. So if you have any questions, you're welcome to email me. Otherwise, love to see you at the real demos in the classroom because I'm always there to help answer questions. Signing off, I wanted to show you sort of what I'm going to call the challenge exercises. So the challenge exercise is another video I did using the same rocket, moon, and Earth, but it allows us to see sort of a few different things we can do. And so if you want to try this as a second assignment or just sort of see other things you can do, that's fine. So if you want to try it, this is what it looks like. So I've got the rocket lift off from the moon, but then the camera follows the rocket, and the moon leaves, and the rocket arrives at Earth, and then it goes down into the atmosphere and arrives somewhere in Texas, because that's where rockets go. So if you want to try the challenge exercise as a kind of homework, if not, no worries. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching.